smart!
By the Heartland Worker Center.
Hello, and welcome to the Heartland Worker Center's Work Smart Wage Theft webinar. My name is Micky Devitt, and I'm a labor lawyer and also the legal and policy coordinator of the Heartland Worker Center. So I will be presenting tonight's web training, but also doing a live Q&A on Facebook. So stick around to the end and you'll see the information to join us on that. So what are we going to talk about tonight? So first of all, we're going to cover sort of what wage theft is, how to identify it. We're going to talk about workers' rights and employers' obligations under the law generally. We will cover what's covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. And then we'll talk about some ways that you can take action to avoid wage theft in the first place and protect yourself in a job, as well as options you have if you have been a victim of wage theft. So first, what is wage theft? Wage theft is any time you don't receive full payment for the work you have completed after you complete it on a regular payday. So if your paycheck is delayed, if your last paycheck doesn't come to you, if you get a partial paycheck, or if you're not being paid overtime, all of those things constitute wage theft. Wage theft is a huge problem in the United States. Just in the year 2017, an estimated 2.4 million workers, just in the 10 most populous states, so not counting the full 50 states, lost an estimated $8 billion just in minimum wage violations. So just a part of wage theft in 10 states was $8 billion. Compare that in the same year to all property theft combined in the United States was only $15.3 billion. So we're talking about a huge problem. And it's not just in the United States. Here in Nebraska specifically, it is the biggest complaint that we get at the Heartland Worker Center. So of all the cases we helped employees with in 2019, 63 of them were wage complaints. Compare that to other complaints about working conditions. It's only 8 cases. Discrimination is only 23. That was even the next largest number of cases. It really is a big problem here in Nebraska too. So the first thing that you need to be able to tell if you are having a wage theft problem is to determine whether you're an employee or a subcontractor. Why this is important is because employees are protected by a lot of wage and hour laws, and subcontractors are not. There's different ways for them to recover any wages or payments owed to them, and so it's important to know which you are. An employee is going to be someone who is hired for an hourly or salary regular pay. They usually work on a schedule set by their boss. They're going to receive instructions from their boss about how they work, where they work, when they work. They'll receive materials and tools from their boss to do that work, and they typically aren't investors in the business. Now, a subcontractor, by comparison, is usually someone who's owning and operating a small business. So someone who's, for example, doing landscaping work, and they own all of their own trucks and materials, and they maybe even pay a crew. Usually they're going to be paid on a project basis or by work completed, not on a regular salary or hourly pay. So a subcontractor also will typically make their own work schedule. They will provide their own materials and tools, and usually they'll be investors in the business. So what that means is they're going to get to keep profits, and they're going to potentially incur losses. So if those things are true, you're probably a subcontractor. Now, a lot of employers will misclassify you, so it's how you do your work that matters, not necessarily how your employer classifies you or they have you fill out a W-2 or W-9. So if you are an employee, and you've determined that, your employer has legal obligations for you. And as a worker, you are going to have all the rights we're talking about, regardless of your immigration status. All of these things apply regardless of how you're documented. Now, backing up a little bit, what is the difference between a right and a benefit? So when we think about rights, we are typically thinking about things. When you have a right to something, it's because it's encoded somewhere in our laws, whether that's the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, those are rights. And your workers' rights are typically going to be laws passed by the state or federal Congresses. Those are going to be enforced by government agencies. Those are rights. Those are things you have, regardless of what employer you work at. Policies and benefits, by contrast, are things that you only get because an employer offers them to you. So those are typically going to be in your employee manual, and those are going to be things that the business owners offer to you to keep you employed or to entice you to remain employed. So things like holiday pay are not required by law. They are just a benefit that your employer is offering you. So we're going to switch now to sort of talking about what pay for work completed means. These are the two agencies that enforce wage and hour laws in the United States. The federal agency, the U.S. Wage and Hour Division, enforces most minimum wage laws, overtime laws, and other things. Nebraska Department of Labor enforces state level protections. And depending on what protection you're trying to invoke, you're going to go to a different agency. So the Fair Labor Standards Act is enforced by the Wage and Hour Division of the Federal Department of Labor. They have oversight over things like the minimum wage, overtime. They have record-keeping requirements for employers about when and how employees are paid, and they also enforce child labor standards. So if you have an issue falling in one of those categories, you're probably going to be able to call the Wage and Hour Division. There is some differences, though, between minimum wage laws at the federal and state level. So federal minimum wage currently is $7.25 an hour. And so that's going to apply anywhere in the country that doesn't have a higher minimum wage. Iowa is one of those places. Nebraska, though, has a $9 per hour minimum wage. So if you have a minimum wage violation in Nebraska, you're going to want to go to Nebraska, the Nebraska Department of Labor. And this $9 an hour, so that applies also to tipped workers. So tipped workers get paid a minimum wage of $2.13 an hour from their employer. However, an employer is required to make up any difference between that amount and $9 per hour if your tips don't reach that threshold on average. So you're still going to be guaranteed $9 per hour. And if you're not getting tips, if you're a tipped employee and you're not getting tips that average $9 an hour, you're still entitled to that. So the lawful forms of payment in the United States are cash and check. Check includes electronic forms of payment like direct deposit. But an employer cannot pay you in store or business credit or some other in-kind way through products or other things. An employer has to pay you in money. That used to not be the case, now it is. And they must also keep a record of all payments to you. There's a record-keeping obligation on their part to say when and how much they are paying people. By Nebraska law, employers must also provide you with a pay stub, and that is true whether you are paid in cash or check or personal check. So you should get a statement every time you're paid showing how much you were paid, what you were paid for, and any deductions that came out. Your overtime rights are different depending on where you live. In Nebraska, there is no overtime state law. So overtime is only due in the state of Nebraska if it's in your employment contract. But at the federal level, overtime is required for any hours you work over 40 in 1 week. So Monday through Sunday of any given week, if you work more than 40 hours in whatever your pay week is, you are entitled to time and a half for all additional hours. Now, so if you have an overtime issue, you're going to want to go to that Federal Department of Labor. Some exceptions are executives and professionals. Administrative workers doesn't mean just office workers. It means someone who is a higher up management in the country, an administrator in the company. And outside sales, people who get commissions may not be entitled to overtime. What can employers take out of your check? So, in the normal course of business, an employer is required to withhold federal, state, Social Security, and other payroll taxes from employees' taxes. And so that's why you're going to fill out that W-2, and an employer should be withholding that and on your behalf before they pay you. If you are an employee and not a subcontractor and your employer is failing to do that, you're going to be liable for those, so you want to make sure those deductions are happening. However, any other deduction can only be done if you agree to it in writing. And how this typically works is when you sign on with an employer and you start filling out all those benefits paperwork, that's going to be where you've agreed in writing for them to withhold for medical expenses, for example, or for other benefits and retirement and things like that. Before you start, so one of the ways we think is that we recommend is before you start, you want to make sure that you have some kind of agreement with your employer about what your employment's going to look like. And that can be in a written form. That's less typical, but you can have a written employment contract with all of your terms and conditions in it. However, contracts are binding and enforceable still if they are verbal, but you're going to have to be able to prove what that agreement was. Proof can be, for example, texts and emails saying what your wages are or when your start date is, all those kinds of things, voicemails, any way that you can document what the agreement is, even if it's not a formal or written contract. So whether or not you do this in writing, before you begin working, you need to reach agreement on your rate of pay, anything that expenses you will be reimbursed for. We encourage you to get the name, address, and telephone of your contractor or employer, the job locations you'll be working at, and any of the owners of the property that you might be working at. That's going to be important to protect yourself later on. You also want an agreement on how you're going to carry out the work, all those things like tools and schedules and things like that, and then when and how you will be paid. So you want agreement on all those things before you start work, and to the extent you can get confirmation in writing, that's always the best. So once you've begun work, how can you work to prevent wage theft? We recommend that you keep a daily log for yourself of hours worked, when you take breaks and how many and how long, and when your lunch or meal breaks are separately. So even though an employer might have a time clock, if you keep your own records, you can then verify later if those time clocks are being changed or manipulated in some way, if you're keeping your own records. We also recommend that you ask for a copy of any documents you sign. That would include those withholding documents at the beginning, but also your check stubs. A lot of employers are going to provide electronic check stubs, and then you won't have access once you've quit. So you want to make sure that you're printing copies or saving them in some way as you go. So in terms of preventing wage theft, what we recommend is that you always prefer or ask to be paid by check or direct deposit rather than cash. Cash is very handy, but it is very hard to track. It's very hard to prove when you received a payment. So we recommend a form of payment that allows you to document when and how you are paid. One quick thing about that, a bounce paycheck is considered fraud in addition to wage theft. And so we're going to talk about some additional protections also that are afforded when you insist on being paid by check. The other thing to be mindful of is that if your employer does pay you cash, they are still required to provide a pay stub and keep records. So if you're paid in cash, insist on also being provided with a pay stub. One way that you can prevent wage theft that a lot of people don't necessarily think about is that under the National Labor Relations Act, which is enforced by the NLRB, you have the right to bargain collectively with your employer. What does this mean? You can organize with your coworkers and you can get together, talk about your problems, and you're protected if you then collectively go try to address a problem with your employer. If they retaliate against you in any way, you can go to the NLRB. This is important because a lot of people don't know that you have the right to talk about your pay and talk about wage problems and talk about wage rates with your coworkers so that you know that you are all being treated fairly. If you're experiencing wage theft, the odds are your coworkers are experiencing something similar, and you can go together to try to address it. It's just one more avenue for protection. So what happens if you do all these things right and you're still a victim of wage theft? You get a short paycheck, you get a late paycheck. So what you can do is going to depend on whether, again, you're an employee or an independent contractor. So going back to that list at the beginning, if you've determined that you are an actual employee, you can file a complaint with the Nebraska Department of Labor or the U.S. Wage and Hour Division. That's for, remember, if you have overtime issues, that's going to be where you want to go. All other issues with wage theft, you should be able to go to the Nebraska Department of Labor first. There's also the Douglas County Bad Check Division, and we're going to provide you these addresses later, but the bounce checks issue that we talked about before, if you have been paid with a check and that was a bad check, this is an avenue that's a little faster than just starting over with a wage claim. Independent contractors, however, can't go to the Department of Labor because they're not employees and they're not protected by those same laws, but it is still theft. So in addition to going to the bad check division, if you've been paid with a bounce check for a project or for a building contract, you can also file a claim in small claims court, or you can sue if it's over the $3,500 limit for that, if you are not paid. This can be particularly important if you also have people on your crew and you're responsible for their payrolls. It might be a little bigger than $3,500. You can go to state court for that or county court to sue. But if you're under $3,500, small claims court is really valuable. You can also record a construction lien with the county if the work is for a construction project. What this essentially is that you are taking the property that you worked to improve and recording a debt on that property that they have to pay before they can do anything with the property. So where do you go for these things? At the state level, you're going to want to reach out to the Nebraska Department of Labor. This is the wage and hour department that's going to be the most helpful to you most of the time. So take note of these. You can go back and write them down. But these are for all regular wage theft claims for employees other than those for overtime. For overtime, you're going to want to go to the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor. They are also going to be where you probably want to file any child labor complaints, incidentally. So this is the Bad Check Division that I mentioned before, and this is how you contact the Bad Check Unit. And what you're going to want to do if you've received a bounced paycheck is keep a copy of the check and a receipt from the bank, and then you bring a $10 fee per check in, file it, and the signer of the check has 10 days to pay the check and fines because it's actually a fraud issue in addition to a wage theft issue. At the county level, this is the contact information for the small claims courts, and that's where you'll want to go either once if you are an independent contractor and you're seeking unpaid wages, or once you've gone through the Department of Labor's wage theft complaint process. If your employer still insists on refusing to pay, you may end up in this small claims court too. This is where you're going to record one of those construction liens against a property that you worked on but were not paid for. So you'll put a debt, basically record a debt on the property for the amount of wages you're owed, and then once that debt is paid, you go through a process to remove that lien. All right, so I think we covered what wage theft is. Hopefully I answered your questions about what your rights are and what some of the employer's obligations are under the law, and particularly the Fair Labor Standards Act. We talked a little bit about how to avoid wage theft proactively, and we gave you some options to exercise if you have been the victim of wage theft. If you have questions or comments, please join our Facebook Live Q&A. It's going to be on April 22nd at 5 p.m. at the Heartland Worker Center's Facebook page. We'll be there to answer questions, and we'll also be monitoring the comments. If you aren't able to make that time, we'll be answering them in writing also. So please join us for that. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you stay safe out there. Thank you.